Hello, we're back. It's been a little over a week since the 2023 NBA draft. I've given myself a little time to think, and today I'm going to divvy out letter grades for each team. I do want to say really quickly, with the draft over, my offseason is officially here. If there's any specific content you want to see from this channel over the next few months, feel free to drop a comment. I'll be looking at all of those. I'm going to have some 2024 stuff planned, maybe some general NBA content, but for the most part, I'm going to be trying some new stuff, mixing it up, seeing what works, what doesn't, so I will be looking for you all's input. So without further ado, let's do it. Draft grades. First up, we have my top graded team, the San Antonio Spurs. They could have left with just one pick, top draftee and generational talent Victor Wembanyama, and it would have granted them an A+ grade regardless. But leaving with Ignite forward Sidi Sissoko, 44th overall, a player I really like and a pick I think ended up generating really good value, is just icing on the cake. Wembanyama will obviously be the focal point in San Antonio moving forward, but Sissoko makes a lot of sense as a bulky wing who could blossom into a strong secondary playmaker alongside Sohan, Vassell, Johnson, and more. We knew months ahead of time, but the Spurs were big winners on the night. One of the best overall classes, I think the Trailblazers made it out of the draft with 3 longtime NBAers with varying degrees of talent. If you've seen my other videos, you know I'm massively high on Ignite guard Scoot Henderson. I think he's a bona fide perennial all-star. I also think Iowa's Chris Murray is set to be a hyper role player or even longtime NBA starter due to his length, shooting, and defense. And NBL guard Ryan Rupert, 43rd overall as a high upside defensive swing, is incredible value. I think he'll carve out a nice role in the NBA and offers vastly different things in the backcourt with Scoot. I think the Blazers had a really strong draft and are leaving with a class that's going to have a massive impact on their already bright future. Probably my favorite class from the entire draft, I have the Utah Jazz with a standing A after leaving with 3 players that I actually all had lottery grades on via my big board. UCF forward Taylor Hendricks at number 9 initially felt a little weird, especially for a team that could have stood to use some of their higher picks on upside swings, but that is clearly what they did at 16 and 28 in taking offensive savants like Baylor's Keontae George and Ohio State's Bryce Sensabaugh. I think George at 16 is potentially the steal of the draft. He's one of my favorite players from the cycle and a guy I really think has a bright NBA future as a hyper scorer. I also feel similarly about Sensabaugh. I know there's some injury concerns there, but I see no future where he's not going to put the ball through the hoop at a good rate. The Utah Jazz were silent winners on the night comparatively, but winners nonetheless. I've given Houston a grade of A-. A lot of people had them as winners of the draft, grabbing Villanova's Cam Whitmore at 20th overall, and while I'm sure Cam will end up being a fine player, I do generally think there's some merit to slides like that. Regardless, the first A- of this video still gives them the 4th best draft ranking for me. I think Thompson is an incredible addition if they manage to develop him correctly and not relegate him to the bench or an off-ball role. And I do think, despite me being lower on Whitmore going into the draft, that he has potential to be a really solid long-time starter. Houston did great with the options that were presented to them. Rounding out the top 5 and the A tier is the Orlando Magic, who grabbed Arkansas guard Anthony Black at 6th overall and Michigan hybrid Jet Howard at number 11. I've been pretty vocal about AB in this cycle. I had him ranked 4th on my board. I've talked about his fit with the Magic before, and I think it's a phenomenal one. I believe he'll be a really strong connective piece in this core that's going to make some noise in the Eastern Conference really soon. Howard wasn't my favorite selection at number 11. It did feel like a little bit of a reach, but I can certainly understand going to get your guy, and I think he does add plenty of skills that Orlando desperately needs, primarily floor spacing. I think the Magic had a great draft night, and I expect both of these guys to see a lot of year 1 run. Leading the B tier is the Toronto Raptors, who drafted Kansas's Grady Dick 13th overall. This wasn't a pick I initially loved, but it quickly grew on me, and in an effort to make this video cohesive with my big board, I've graded them pretty high on this list. I'm a big believer in Grady. I had him 6th on my board. I think he's much more than a shooter and has some real star potential down the line. As an elite floor spacer with moderate athleticism, decent handling, and solid finishing. I don't see any reason why I should lower the Raptors' grade on him simply because on paper they're drafting him to fill a strictly shooter role. If they're spending a lottery pick on him, maybe they're seeing what I am. I think this was a phenomenal pick and great value at 13. One of the more polarizing drafts, and for good reason. The Hornets left with 4 players: Brandon Miller at number 2, Nick Smith Jr. at number 27, James Najee at number 31, and Amari Bailey at number 41. I've given them a grade of B+. I don't think the Hornets necessarily maximized their value with these picks, but I also don't think they had a bad draft by any means. Miller is a very good basketball player who's going to be a really strong piece for the foreseeable future. I'm not necessarily a Nick Smith guy, but this is the exact range I'd feel comfortable taking a shot on him, and I can totally respect that. Najee and Bailey are good second-round picks that have potential to blossom into long-term role players. Again, not necessarily what I would have done, but far from a bad draft and totally deserving of its B+ grade. Our 8th ranked team, the Oklahoma City Thunder, traded up a few spots on draft night to grab Kentucky combo guard Cason Wallace 10th overall. They also came out of the draft with Keontae Johnson as a late second flyer. Wallace is a phenomenal addition to the Thunder, and I think he was a great value pick even considering the trade up. I had him ranked 5th on my personal board. I see no multiversal timeline where he isn't impactful in some way or another. He's going to offer Oklahoma City versatility on the defensive end as a really strong off-ball and team defender, and another point of attack option next to SGA and Lou Dort. Offensively, he'll add versatility as a combo guard well in being the backup point guard and spot-up shooter. Another really strong draft for Sam Presti and the Thunder org. The last B+ is the Sacramento Kings, who I think had a phenomenal draft acquiring Colby Jones and Jalen Slauson relative to their positions. I think both of these guys, especially Jones, have the potential to be connective NBA starters, so grabbing them in the second round is really good value. I had Colby in my early 20s, I'm really high on him and think he's going to make a solid impact for the Kings bench in year 1 and years to come. Slauson is another player I think is going to be impactful, potentially to a lesser extent, but is still about as good a value at 54 as it gets. Great draft for the Kings coming off their best season in years. Capping off the top 10 is the Los Angeles Lakers, who drafted just outside the lottery at number 17 and in the mid-second at number 40. I don't love the immediate fit of Jalen Hood-Schifino on this Lakers roster, but I can applaud LA for looking to the future for the first time in a while. There were a few more options on the board here when they were on the clock that could have helped more in a win-now sense, but I think the Hood-Schifino pick is a strong selection as a potential point guard of the future, and this is the exact range I had him in. I also had Maxwell Lewis in my mid-20s, so I think he's impeccable value at 40, and I actually think he'll pack more of a year 1 punch than people think in terms of athleticism, shooting, defense, and some rare creation. Very, very solid draft from the Lake Show. I think Brooklyn had a great draft, grabbing Alabama's Noah Clowney at 21, Duke's Dariq Whitehead at 22, and Kansas's Jalen Wilson in the late second round. I was admittedly skeptical on Brooklyn's direction heading into this draft. They hadn't shown that they were willing to deal Mikal Bridges, which is fine, but I felt they were dangerously close to NBA purgatory. But I think they did a really good job getting Clowney and Whitehead back to back. I think both of these players, 2 of the youngest in the entire class, offer in the least some projectable role players, but also have a ton of upside. Clowney being a potential lengthy floor spacer and versatile defender, and Whitehead having some of the highest upside in the class, injury aside. I think the Nets did really good. After grabbing Azar Thompson at 5 and Marcus Sasser at 25, I've given the Pistons a grade of B. I think Azar is a really solid pick. He's a great middle ground between the upside swing that Detroit needs due to lack of overall talent, and he has these high floor qualities like defense and connective passing that I think make him a strong fit in the Pistons' current core. The Sasser pick perplexes me a little bit. I was high on him coming into the season, and he didn't necessarily impress me in a few areas. He's a great shooter and better defender than people give him credit for due to his size. I can see the vision for his role in the NBA, it just wasn't necessarily with Detroit. Overall though, I think the Pistons did a solid job, and I'm excited to see how they fit these pieces in. Another team who I think had a really strong lottery pick, but I was a tad confused by the rest of their draft, the Indiana Pacers, who grabbed Jarris Walker at 8 and then Ben Shepherd, Mojave King, and Isaiah Wong later. I love the Walker pick. I think he's going to fit like a glove. They did a great job of gaining assets from Washington and still getting their guy. I think Shepherd is fine. I personally would have preferred a few other guys here, but I can understand it. And then Mojave King and Isaiah Wong are fine adds as well. Guys who can eventually make the roster down the line. I wouldn't have really done anything different in those slots, but not sure they move the needle for me a ton either. Overall though, the crown jewel of this class for Indiana is Jarris Walker, and again, love his fit as a member of this Pacers core. I've given the Dallas Mavericks a B grade. They left with Derek Lively 12th overall and Olivier Maxence Prosper 24th. I think Dallas had a really good draft night, adding Rashawn Holmes in addition to these two, but I do think Lively at 12, even trading back and with some other teams looming around this spot, was a bit of a reach. I do think he eventually will be a strong traditional center option, and I can at least respect the lottery swing regarding his potential stretch capabilities. And I think Prosper was a really good pick at 24. They got that selection essentially for free in addition to some other production, and I think he'll actually be good enough to make some contributions as a rookie. Really solid draft night for the Mavericks overall. I've given the Pelicans a B-. Their sole pick on the night was selecting Jordan Hawkins 14th overall. I like the Hawkins pick. The Pels struggled from deep and they have plenty of on-ball creators, so Hawkins as an off-ball and three-point shooting savant makes a ton of sense for them from a roster construction standpoint. I likely would have preferred a few others here that had a bit more upside, but it was a fine range for Hawkins and he's going to be a seamless fit on this roster. I've given Boston a grade of B- for their selection of Arkansas guard Jordan Walsh 38 overall. This grade is really a reflection of the value I think the Celtics got at 38. Of course, there's going to be players below this grade that have much higher upside on their respective teams, but I think Walsh has a really strong defensive foundation and a really bright future as a defender in the NBA. I had him in my mid-20s on my board, and I think the Celtics got a surefire NBA contributor in the second round, which warrants a B- grade here. Kicking off the C tier is Washington, who drafted Bilal Coulibaly at 7 and Tristan Vucevic at number 42. I don't think Coulibaly is a bad pick for the Wizards by any means. At 18 years old, he certainly fits their new timeline. He offers a ton in the ways of upside with potential creation, passing, and playmaking ability, and he's going to be a stout defender regardless of any of that. But I've given them a C+ simply because I favored lots of others here at this spot. Jarris Walker, Cason Wallace. I would have loved to have seen them get aggressive with assets for Azar, but that front office got their guy, one who's going to be malleable as they enter this new era. I'm excited to see how it pans out. I gave Golden State a C+. I think they slightly reached in the first round, but got some decent value with their second to last pick. I like Pods a lot. I think he's a strong piece and a really solid potential role player down the line, but I do think he was overdrafted just a hair here. There were some really good options on the board that I would have preferred. TJD is a great value pick at 57. I still don't have a single clue why his stock fell the way it did. I think he's going to be a really strong power forward option with his passing and interior game. The Warriors did a fine job. Denver had a fun draft. They gathered some picks prior to it and were really active on draft night. They earned a C+ from me. I absolutely love everything about the Strawther pick. I think he's a phenomenal individual player, offers great value at 29, fits great with the team, and while Pickett and Tyson don't do quite as much in that regard, I do get drafting both in terms of what they can add to the roster in a few years or even as soon as next season. Not my favorite overall class, but one of my favorite selections in Strawther. I've given Memphis a C+ grade, landing G.G. Jackson at 45 and a draft and stash near the end of the draft at 56. Selecting G.G. at 45 to this roster felt a little weird at first, but I quickly warmed up to it and I think it could be one of the more underrated selections overall. He was the youngest player in the class. Memphis utilizes their G League system well. There's a future where they make it out of this with one of the top talents in the whole class if they play their cards right. It could be an uphill battle for both Jackson and the Grizzlies, but taking him 45th is well worth the shot and I would have done it myself. I've given Minnesota a C+ for their draft, taking Leonard Miller 33rd and Jalen Clark at number 53. I had Leonard Miller as a late lottery grade on my board, so while I love his upside as a big-bodied wing with floor stretching potential, I also do understand the risks involved and why he slid to the early 30s. I don't love his fit here at all, but I can't fault the Wolves for taking a shot on a player I myself thought was good. I can only hope he can carve out an NBA role there with high effort defense and some guard-like tendencies at 6'10". Potentially unpopular, I have given the Hawks a C grade for their drafting of Kobe Bufkin 15th, Mo Gay 39th, and Seth Lundy at 46. I wasn't massively high on Bufkin, and while I understand where they're coming from with the selection and bolstering their guard depth, I just don't love the fit, and I would have preferred others here, meaning it dropped their grade a decent amount. I'm sure Bufkin will pan out and be a solid NBA player, but will that be alongside Trae Young? I'm not so sure, but Gay and Lundy are fine picks relative to their spots. Similarly, I've given Miami a C grade with the drafting of Jaime Jaquez Jr. 18th overall. Firstly, I'm a big fan of Jaquez, I'm a fan of what Miami has built, and I think he fits their mold just fine and will be a solid contributor for them for years to come. Maybe others had a similar idea, but I think this was a pretty big overstep. I would have tried to trade back and grab assets, or just grab some players that I think are more surefire, projectable role guys. Jaquez is sure to be gritty and do all the little things for the Heat. Again, I totally understand the pick, just not personally what I would have done with guys like Chris Murray and Omax on the board. And finally, we have the D tier. I don't want to dive too deep into these picks. I don't want it to sound like I'm harping on these players. I think there ended up being a ton of good players drafted to these teams, but if a team earned a D grade, I didn't feel like they made it out of the draft with good value relative to their spot, or really even had good value to begin with. Hopefully, all of the players drafted by these teams use this as bulletin board material and make me look like an idiot years from now. That is it. Let me know what you thought, what I graded your team, what you would have graded your team, who you wish your team drafted, if you liked who your team drafted, all of the fun stuff. Again, I will be out at the Las Vegas Summer League in just a few short weeks. Really excited for that. If you see me out there, say hey. I have a really fun video planned for next week, a throwback heat check. Really excited for that one. That's it. We'll see you next time.